In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at a few different variations of the slow blues. We're going to start with a simple 1-4-5 progression and then get into some super common harmonic variations. We're going to cover a lot of really useful harmony and theory in this lesson that carries over into other types of tunes and other styles of music. My name is Jack Ruch. Welcome to my channel. Let's get into it. So to get started, let's begin with a simple 1-4-5 progression. Now 1-4-5 refers to the 3 chords of a basic 12-bar blues. And these numbers are assigned to these chords based on their interval relationships. So we're going to be in the key of G, and so G is going to be our 1 chord. And now if we go up a G major scale, 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, we come to C. So C major is the 4 chord in the key of G. And if we go up 5 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get to D major. So D major is the 5 chord in the key of G. Now, since we're playing a blues, we're going to make all these chords dominant 7th chords. So G7, C7, and D7. Now, this number system for identifying chord progressions is super useful because it allows us to quickly transpose things into different keys if we understand the interval relationship. So 1-4-5 in the key of G can be moved up to, for instance, B flat. And we don't have to think about what the different chords are in B flat. We can just understand the interval relationship of the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. So now let's get into what we can play over this type of chord progression. Now from a scale perspective, the simplest solution is to play out of the G major pentatonic and the G minor pentatonic. We can come up with a lot of great blues vocabulary using just those 2 scales over this progression. And now if we want to dig a little bit deeper into each individual chord, the next step would be identifying the chord tones to each of these 3 chords. And for that we can use the G7 arpeggio, a C7 arpeggio, and a D7 arpeggio. Right, so with that material, we can come up with a lot of great lines to play over this type of simple 1-4-5 blues progression. So now I'm going to play a solo example using just these simple ingredients to navigate through the chord changes. And as always, the tabs and notation to these solo examples will be available on my Patreon page. Alright, so this first variation we're going to do on the slow blues is a super common variation that uses a bunch of different chord substitutions that are really going to open things up for playing ideas that fall outside of the basic pentatonic kind of blues licks. Now, this chord progression starts out basically the same as we did before, but in measure 3, we're going to add this little chromatic passing chord where we're going to take our G9 chord and slide it up a half step. Now, the voicing I'm playing here for G9 is a rootless voicing, so I'm playing the 3rd, the flat 7th, the 9th, and the 5th. And when I slide this up, there's a lot of different options of things you could play over this because there's a lot of different ways you can look at this chord, right? You could look at this as an A flat dominant 9 chord, in which case you could play A flat mixolydian. You could also look at this as a C half diminished chord or a C minor 7 flat 5 chord, in which case you might want to play C Locrian. You could also look at this as an E flat minor triad with a major 6 in the bass, so like an E flat minor 6 chord, in which case you might want to play E flat Dorian. And my favorite way to look at this chord, and the way that I'm going to demonstrate in the solo, is to look at this as a D altered dominant chord, where you would have the flat 7, the major 3rd, the flat 13, and the flat 9. And for this, you could play the D altered scale. Right, and so that's what I'm going to use in the solo when we get to that over this little chromatic passing chord. So, for instance, if you're going from G9 and you're playing your kind of G blues stuff, and then you go up to this chord, you could play, and then resolve back to G. Now, the next part of this progression that kind of strays away from the basic 1-4-5 is when we get into this series of minor 7th chords, where we go up to the 2 minor chord, the 3 minor chord, the flat 3 minor chord, and then back to the 2 minor chord. Right, and this happens after we do the 1 chord to the 4 chord in measure 5 and 6. And for this, there's a lot of different things you could play over this, but, understanding your chord tones and where those notes are is super important. So if you're playing over the 2 chord, the A minor, knowing all the chord tones to an A minor 7 chord is super useful. Knowing all the chord tones to a B minor 7 chord, right? Right, and then a B flat minor 7 chord. And being able to target those notes in your lines. Another thing I like to do over minor 7th chords is actually play out of the relative major. So if I'm playing over A minor 7, I'll actually play the chord tones to a C major 7. And this gives me the sound of like an A minor 9 chord without the root. So you get, the flat 3, the 5, the flat 7, and the 9 when you play C major over an A minor. And you can move that around over the different chords. You could play D major 7 over this B minor chord. You could play D flat major 7 over this B flat minor chord. And then so those are really nice sounds you can use over this series of minor 7th chords. And the final variation on this progression is when we go to the 5 chord, we actually go up a half step and go to the flat 6, a flat 6 dominant chord, and then to the 5 chord. And over this flat 6 dominant chord, the thing that I really like to use is the Lydian dominant scale. In this case, it would be like an E flat Lydian dominant scale. And this is really cool because it can resolve really nicely to this 5 chord. So right, so those are all just some little options to keep in mind. Now I'm going to solo over the chord progression, and I'm going to use a lot of these different approaches, these different chord tone approaches and some of these different scales to navigate through these chord changes. And again, the tabs will be up on my Patreon page, so you can follow along there if you want to learn this solo. So for this final variation on the slow blues, we're going to employ some very classic jazz harmony to spice up these basic chord changes. The first thing we're going to do right out of the gate is in the first measure, we're going to use a 2-5-1 cadence to get to the 4 chord. And what that means is we're going from G7 to C7. I'm going to treat that C7 as the 1 chord and play a 2-5-1 to get there. So the 2 chord in C would be D minor, and then the 5 chord, which is our G7, and then resolving to our C7 chord. So that's a really nice thing to outline in your lines because you can play chord tones of those chords to create these nice lines that sort of move through the chords, right? Right, which have a really nice sound. So that's the first variation we're going to do. Then as we get into measures 3 and 4, I'm going to kind of elaborate on that and do a full 3-6-2-5-1 cadence to get back to the 4 chord in measure 5. So these are kind of things you hear a lot in jazz tunes and, you know, more jazzy variations of the blues. And you'll hear a lot about these types of cadences and turnarounds like 6-2-5-1 or 3-6-2-5. So what we're going to do here in measure 3, we're going to play the 1 chord, and then we're going to go up to, again, I'm thinking of this as we're transitioning to the key of C. So I'm going to play off the 3rd of C, which would be the note E. And I'm going to play an E half diminished chord. Then I'm going to move to an A7 chord or an A7 altered dominant chord. Then I'm going to go to R251 in the key of C, which would be D minor 7, then G7, or some kind of G altered 7, and then resolve to C. So in the key of C, that's 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, right? And so this really opens the door for a lot of different options of things you can play. Obviously, chord tones are big, but there's also a lot of functional harmony here. This E minor 7 flat 5 to A7 altered to D minor is a minor 2-5-1. So we can play things like, you know, I might play B flat diminished 7th arpeggio, and then resolve to D minor. Right, or I might play, I might treat this E minor 7 flat 5 chord as like a G minor 6 chord and play G Dorian. And then play something out of this A altered. And then resolve to a chord tone. So there's a lot of different options, and when we get into the solo, I'll employ a few of these different options and you can hear how they sound. Now as we continue on, we go to the 4 chord, and in the second measure of the 4 chord, bar 6, we go up a half step to a diminished passing chord. And this is just a super common way of going from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord. And for that, I'm just going to play right out of that diminished 7th arpeggio. Then as we get back to the 1 chord, then we're going to do a 3-6-2-5, but in the key of G. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing, but these cadences are essentially the same. So now, because we're basically in kind of the turnaround section of the progression, G is our 1 chord, and I'm going to go up to a B minor chord, which would be the minor 3 chord. Then I'm going to go to our 6 chord, E7, and then our 2 minor chord, A minor, and then our 5 chord, or some kind of altered dominant variation on the 5 chord, and then back to the 1. And then in the actual turnaround section, I'm going to do a quick 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, right? So all of that, again, is these, you know, this functional harmony, these little 5-to-1 cadences that I can really flesh out. And just by playing chord tones, you know, I can play... I can flesh out these chords and come up with some really nice lines to play over that stuff. So now I'm going to play the solo. Again, the tabs are available on my Patreon, so go check that out, and you can dig deeper into this solo and kind of analyze some of these things that I'm playing. So check it out. Alright guys, so hopefully this lesson was useful to you. I highly suggest that you go check out the tabs and notation to these solos and kind of dig into it on your own and you know, see how some of this stuff clicks together. Playing over these types of changes, you know, one of the most important and useful things is to really know your chord tones. So understanding the basic triads, understanding the arpeggios for these seventh chords. And then from there, kind of stretching out and getting into some of these altered sounds or Lydian dominant sounds as you feel comfortable with it. But these are the types of things I practice all the time, navigating over these chord changes and moving it around the fretboard so that you can transition through the chords and play the chord tones over each passing chord as it comes. So check out the Patreon page. That's a great way to support this channel. And as always, happy practicing and thanks for the support. I will catch you next time. Take care.